All right. Thanks everyone for coming today. My name is Michael. I'm presenting on my dissertation research project, looking at the challenges of plurilingual and immersion pedagogies. All right, so we'll start with a couple of quotes. As Cook observed, from the end of the 19th century onwards, almost all influential theoretical works on language teaching have assumed without argument that a new language should be taught without reference to the student's first language. And we know over the last decade or so, this has definitely changed. That kind of gives us a historical perspective on the kind of primacy of the kind of monolingual approaches. This assumption has led to English-only policies persisting in English language teaching, which is my context, and a lack of research on the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of such language separation approaches. So as Lynn asserts, we would do well to question the linguistic, educational, and pedagogical implications behind the one classroom, one language pedagogical straitjacket. So that's kind of the starting point that we want to kind of counter some of these English-only policies. Okay. At the same time, then a kind of binary is set up, a kind of mono versus multi. So on one hand, you have maybe monolingual approaches. So we go from trying to find the end of the game, the answer, the truth, or the pedagogical holy grail, to an exploration of the multiplicity of meanings, possibilities, and pedagogies. So this then goes beyond just the mono versus multi-binary to and thinking. And the aim is to uncover a greater range of context-sensitive pedagogical options or measured immersion and plurilingual approaches for more equitable and effective language teaching and learning. So my research questions then, I'm looking at teachers' beliefs on this kind of scale, their policies and practices, their experiences, including benefits and challenges that they experience with their policies and practices. And then I'm comparing a target language embedded context like Canada and a target language removed context, in this case being Japan. Today's presentation, we're going to focus on research question number 3 particularly, and those benefits and challenges. Data collection and analysis. So I used the mixed methods participant selection model. I disseminated a survey with mixed methods, Likert scale, and open-ended questions. After data cleaning, I got 69 responses from Japan and 56 from Canada. How's your math? What's the total? 125. And then I took the 125 and I kind of analyzed for participants of interest for follow-up interviews and observations. So I was able to interview 5 teachers from Japan and 4 in Canada. And then I was able to finally go to Japan in November. I had to wait 2.5 years for the borders to open during COVID, right? So I was able to observe 4 teachers in Japan and 1 in Canada. And starting, up until this point now, data analysis is going on. So doing some statistical analyses as well as thematic analysis in vivo. So today we're going to look especially at the open-ended survey questions data from that process. So in my kind of analysis of my participant group, I kind of identified 5 kind of orientations. So there were 12 very extreme kind of monolingual teachers who outright rejected any other languages, very strict kind of English-only policies. I had 38 which were more mono-leaning, so they wanted to avoid other languages, but not entirely reject them. A mixed orientation who allow and use other languages, but with kind of caveats. And this kind of group would often vacillate. So sometimes they'd be, on some questions, they'd be more on the mono side. On some questions, they'd be more on the multi-side. So this, you can see this orientation, the real kind of complexity in that. And then a multi-leaning group, 31, that try to leverage other languages. And then finally, a multi-group who employ a stated plurilingual and translanguaging approach. Okay, so the first thing that I noticed here is that there's very few teachers on the kind of extremes of the there's much more kind of teachers in the middle, right? And so that kind of breaks down this mono versus multi-binary, right? Okay, I then I combined the mono and mono-leaning and the multi and multi-leaning into 3 groups. for my analysis. So let's take a look at what these groups expressed as the benefits and challenges they experience. So one of the common themes among the mono group was they felt that because they have these kind of immersion approaches, that students kind of improve their speaking more quickly. So the idea of a speaking fluency increase when students push themselves to take more risks. They also noticed an increase in motivation and confidence, especially in the Japan group. The fact that they experience that they can communicate in English, they're motivated to practice more, and that this kind of leads to more interest in English learning or studying abroad. And also the student expectations. So especially in Canada, a lot of the teachers talked about how students are expecting to be immersed in the language. That's why they're coming to Canada. So it's what my students want to maximize exposure. And then again, this idea of rapid acquisition, right? As far as the challenges, these teachers are often fighting against students' other languages or L1s. So trying to wean themselves off their dictionaries and reliance on the same language classmates, that they have difficulty trusting their ability to operate exclusively in the target language. Lack of understanding, this idea that students need the idea of this crutch. They feel lost or unintelligent. And this teacher tries to reassure them that it's okay to not understand everything. And then resistance, some students would refuse to use English exclusively because it is possible for them to communicate with others in the same class in their L1s, right? Okay, as far as the multi-group, on the opposite side, they felt that one of the themes was that there's an increase in kind of understanding in the classroom. So one teacher in Japan talked about the fact that the students are able to understand complex linguistic concepts and phonetic articulations when he describes it in Japanese, right? And then they're able to understand those concepts. If he tried to do so in English, there'd be limited understanding, right? This idea of rapport, that students feel more comfortable and confident, it keeps engagement and gains trust when we're able to use multiple languages in the classroom. And then other aspects that are effective benefits, so greater confidence and respect, less anxiety, and students feel respected and valued for their knowledge and expertise as adults when their L1 is not devalued. And finally, in the multi-challenges, expectations of students and colleagues. So one teacher talked about how using other languages for their colleagues, the colleagues think that is proof of lower proficiency or less effective instruction. One teacher in Japan said, I mainly get scolded by decaying old administrators who haven't taken a language class since bell bottoms were in fashion. So this tension with the colleagues and the admin. This group also kind of struggles with the balance between target language and other languages. So one teacher in Canada said students can take the use of their languages too far and forget to use English altogether, which is still ultimately the target language, right? Okay, and then this idea of exclusion, particularly in Canada, that when you have students from one language background and there's no other students that share that background, they might feel excluded. Or when the teacher has a language that they know from some of the students and they're using that language, how do the other students feel? They feel maybe a little bit excluded from that process too, right? Okay, finally, we have the mixed orientation, and you can see some of the caveats that they supply here. So they're talking about, measured use of the L1. So in this case, sometimes less anxiety. So it doesn't serve anyone well when I'm the English police. Students are more agreeable to operate in the target medium when it's not under duress. Again, increased understanding. So students, it prevents frustration when they can briefly lapse into their native languages. So again, that idea of, a brief lapse. And then using the students' L1 selectively assists with stumbling blocks and barriers that could be time consuming and hinder comprehension. And finally, student expectations, not being viewed as a complete asshole for cracking down on students for resorting to their L1. So again, this idea, I don't want to be the English police, but I also don't want, the L1 to get out of hand, right? Okay. And then as far as the challenges here, I think here's where we can see some ways forward. And I'll read these. So again, this idea of trying to balance How much target language are we using? How much other languages are we using? So one participant in Japan said, I need to be careful not to use Japanese myself in a way that might suggest I do not think the students are able to understand my English. I want to encourage them, not insult them. It can also be difficult to strike a balance between using L1 as needed and using it simply because it is easier or because others are using it. I find it can be useful to make it clear which language or languages students should use for specific tasks. Otherwise, students can get confused about my expectations. So the idea there being kind of having a hybrid approach where, okay, in this task, this activity, let's try a more kind of plurilingual approach and bring a bunch of language, or other languages in. And then in other activities, we might say, okay, let's try an immersion activity now where we try to operate, for as much as possible in the target medium. One of my participants in Japan, she actually negotiates this with her students. So, for this next activity, what percentage of the target language would you like to use, for example, right? And then one last quote, one teacher in Japan said, not all students learn the same way. Some students learn better by looking at comparisons into language for confirmation and also to understand difficult topics. Not being able to use the L1 may create mental blocks for the students and barriers for learning. On the other hand, some students may also, appreciate or benefit from those kind of immersion approaches and experiences. Okay, so finally, the takeaways and pedagogical options here. So we can see that there's complexity in teachers' orientation to classroom language use. They don't neatly fit into this mono multi-binary. And again, few outright reject other languages or employ a stated plurilingual or translanguaging approach. Across the spectrum, then teachers struggle with this balance between target language and other linguistic resources. So each group, the mono, the multi, and the mixed. The idea here, it doesn't have to be a competition, right? So the classroom can vacillate back and forth and in between languages, translanguaging and immersion pedagogy. Again, oftentimes teachers will report that in the planning stages, in the preparation stages, the analysis stages, students are using multiple languages. And then often in the production stage, that might be more kind of the immersion principles in the target language. So that's one kind of aspect where this can be applied in pedagogy. The idea then, if we have this hybrid approach, we can enhance the benefits and limit the challenges, right? So for example, a lack of understanding and resistance that the mono group talked about can be mitigated if, we have this kind of hybrid approach in our classrooms. Okay. And then the importance of negotiated context-sensitive classroom language practices. So one teacher from Canada said, language policy is a fluid and adaptable thing that changes as needed based on the environment and setting. So again, it doesn't have to be a one-size-fits-all policy, right? It can be adaptable, it can be dynamic, depending on, the goals of the activity or the lesson. So ultimately, we want to go beyond the binary and think beyond this kind of either or proposition and think about when and how and why and what for we can use, plurilingual strategies. And then also when and how and why and what for we can use more kind of immersion approaches, right? So that is the end of my presentation. Here's my references. Do we have time for questions?
We do. We have a few moments. So if there is a question,